Hey, kid.
Irving.
What you said to me last night? It was cruel. Helly was never cruel. So if you're not her, then who are you?
What is up, everybody? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. Episode 4 of Severance is here, and this is by far the most mind-bending episode of television I've seen in a very long time, with some of the best performances we've seen to this point on the entire series. With Irving B. himself, of course, being the MVP of the episode. Not only do we learn a little bit more about the extremely dark origins of Kier's childhood, but we also learned a little bit more about our innies on this episode as well, as they tread the same footsteps as Kier and his brother did once upon a time. Not only will our innies be heading to the very same location where Kier first tamed the Four Tempers for the very first time, but one of our innies will also be faced with their own version of their first temper as well, as Irving himself confronts the temper of woe. Which then of course leads to one of the biggest revelations of the entire season. The episode starts off with our innies waking up in the middle of the frozen wilderness, which we then learn is dubbed the Deeter-Egan National Forest, with Deeter of course being revealed to be the twin brother of Kier when he was a child. And here we see all four of our innies make it to the top of the cliff where a convenient orientation video is waiting for them. Which was pretty interesting to say the least, as the first time we see a wide shot of Mark on top of this cliff, there is no TV in sight, and then in the next frame, it magically appears. And then of course there are the mysterious shadow twins that the MDR team begin to see beckoning them on their journey, although I do have a feeling I know what these things might potentially be, and how they can be tied directly to the severed floor itself. And after seeing this episode, I'm starting to think that it's no coincidence that there are 4 Tempers and 4 MDR employees. With Irving taming the temper of woe himself, I get the feeling that each of our other innies are also going to have to confront a temper of their own before the season is out, with Frolic, Dread, and Malice still in play. And if nothing else, it should be interesting to see the physical manifestations of the other 3 tempers. Now, of course, we have seen physical representations of these tempers on the show already, both represented in the painting of Kier taming the 4 tempers, and represented at Dylan's waffle party as well, with Woe being depicted as a bride, with Frolic being depicted as a jester, with Dread being depicted as an old lady, and Malice depicted as a goat. And I get the feeling that Mark, Dylan, and Helly are each going to have to tame one of the 3 remaining tempers. And part of me is also starting to wonder if the Lumon board itself is also comprised of only 4 people, each a representation of one of these tempers as well, as we have already met a potential board member who is clearly the representation of Frolic, as per his tattoo on his hand. But after an orientation film from Mr. Milchick fills the severed employees in on how they will be walking in the same footsteps as Kier once did, the story officially begins. And right from the very beginning of the journey, Irving is very suspicious of Helly, and how he believes she is not telling the full truth about what she saw on the outside world. And you do almost get the sense that Irving is acting like the parent of the severed crew here the entire time, trying to protect Mark and Dylan from what is really going on with Helly, as he is constantly warning Mark to stay away from her. But after the orientation video sends them to a place called Scissors Cave, they learn that there is a 4th appendix that Kier drew upon his deathbed, in which he tells the story of his twin brother, Deeter. And one thing we learn early on is that Deeter and Kier were never apart from one another, almost as if Kier and his twin brother were the first representation of a severed individual. And how Kier first going on to tame the temper of woe is essentially the story of him severing himself from his emotional connection to his brother, of which he thought of as a weakness. But a few ghostly shadow twins later, our innies finally arrive at Woe's Hollow, as they are greeted by Milchick and Mini Milchick. And one thing I wish the episode did explore a little bit deeper was the gravitas of the innies seeing the outside world for the very first time. Like Mark holding fire for the first time, like them seeing snow in the wilderness for the first time. I felt like there could have been a few ways that they could have conveyed just how big this moment was for the innies after all. But one thing that was pretty interesting was the innies coming upon their first dead animal, which of course was not put there by accident, with Irving suggesting they eat the creature as he wasn't sure if there would be any food upon their arrival, which, if nothing else, was a pretty good way to showcase that the innies are essentially still children, which we see reflected yet again when they finally meet Milchick at Woe's Hollow, and the first thing on Irving's mind is how starving they are, Like children who have just expended too much energy, all they can think about is food. And upon arriving at Woe's Hollow, we see the four innies' shadow twins standing atop the waterfall. Lumon essentially provides shadow twins for each of the innies for them to experience a similar feeling as Deeter and Kier experience upon their first entry to Woe's Hollow themselves. And with the shadow twins being a product of Lumon, I get the sense that they were created right there on the severed floor at Optics and Design. Not so much clones of themselves, but 3D printed copies, meant to guide them on their path to Woe's Hollow, just as Kier had his own twin Deeter guiding him. And here we learn the shocking truth about the relationship between Deeter and Kier, and how it was incredibly dark to say the least, and how it seems Kier ended up killing his own brother, very Cain and Abel-like, as Kier went on to tame his very first temper in Woe, which is essentially him overcoming the sadness of losing his brother. And the description of his brother's death was very interesting to say the least. First hearing his eye pop out of his socket with pus falling down his skull, and then of course his hair turning to moss as it falls off his bloody scalp, which is most likely meant to describe how Kier killed his own brother Deeter. Hearing his eye pop from his skull makes you think that he was killed by blunt force, similar to the biblical tale of Cain and Abel. But the description of his hair turning to moss and falling from his scalp almost sounded like some sort of chemical death. After all, we do know an ether factory was nearby, which Kier himself would later go on to work at. But upon closer inspection, the sound of his brother Deeter grasping for his hair turning to moss and falling off of his scalp also sounds an awful lot like a metaphor for his body's decomposition and being taken back by nature, which is something we see earlier in the episode when our MDR team come upon their first dead animal, the dead seal that is decomposing back into the snow. Not exactly the tale of brotherly love at the end of the day. And then, of course, perhaps the most tragic incident in the entire episode, Milchick deprives the innies of their very first experience of a roasted marshmallow, thanks to Helly's response to the story, which of course was just one of many different examples of Helly not quite acting herself on this journey, which Irving was noticing right away, as he continues to press Helly about what she really saw in the outside world, sensing that she is not quite telling the truth, with Helly then landing a pretty low blow on Irving in return when she brings up Bert and how he will never see him again. Yet another telltale sign that Helly was not quite herself. But then, of course, we have the scene that is probably going to have the biggest implications on Severance going forward in the next few episodes. And that, of course, is Helena pretending to be Helly and sleeping with Mark S., which is wrong on so many levels. But one thing I did find a little bit interesting during the scene was some of the dialogue from Helena, stating to Mark that she wasn't proud of who she was on the outside, almost as if these are true words coming directly from Helena, almost like she really doesn't like who she is on the outside, almost like she wants her life to be Helly's. I get the feeling Helena's time pretending to be Helly has been the only time she has ever experienced true happiness, albeit as deceptive as it is. And seeing how our characters are going to respond to this over the next few episodes is going to be interesting to say the least. I imagine Mark is not going to be too happy when he finds out that Helena tricked him into sleeping with him pretending to be Helly, and I imagine Mark's Audi is not going to be too pleased as well, considering he had no say in this whatsoever. And then, of course, there's how the real Helly is going to feel about all this as well, knowing that Mark wasn't able to tell the difference between her and Helena deep down. An all-around messed up situation, to say the least. Which of course also goes on to raise the very profound question of consent between severed employees and intimate relationships. But upon Irving's departure from the camp, he ventures deeper into the forest, where he will go on to confront his own first temper in Woe, while confronting the sadness of losing Burr. And one thing we notice in this scene is Irving seeing on the screen in front of him the letters on MDR spelling out Egan, which seemed to be the last sign Irving needed to be sure that Helly wasn't Helly at all, but her Audi the entire time, as Irving eventually catches up to Helly at the waterfall at Woe's Hollow, with Irving realizing that only an Egan would have enough power to send their Audi to the severed floor. And thanks to a very interesting interview John Turturro did on this episode, we now know why he was so relentless in his pursuit to uncover Helena, and how the Night Gardener detail just never sat right with him, which he describes as his Audi's training kicking into focus, which of course goes on to cast an even more mysterious light on Irving's Audi than was already there. Just who exactly is he at the end of the day? What kind of training does he have, and is he already part of the rebellion? As next we see Irving threatening to drown Helena unless Milchick switches her back to Helly, which in a sense is Irving knowingly sacrificing himself in order to bring Helly back. as I'm sure he knows there will be dire consequences for his actions. But Irving's sacrifice at least does end up bearing fruit, as he does manage to bring Helly back to the severed team, albeit at the cost of his own life. And in hindsight, I can't help but notice the monumental foreshadowing for this scene that we see earlier in the season, when the MDR team is watching their first orientation video and we see Helly bobbing for pineapples. A striking visual resemblance, if nothing else. And I certainly cannot praise John Turturro's performance enough in this episode. This was certainly his finest hour on Severance yet. After all, being brave enough to knowingly sacrifice himself in order to bring Helly back was honorable to say the least. And I absolutely love the slight smirk and the defiant look in Irving's eyes as he stares down Milchick face to face, not backing down for an inch. And seeing the evolution of Irving come full circle in this episode was also very interesting. After all, Irving was probably the most loyal to Lumon at the beginning of the series when his innie was first introduced to us, compared to now and the defiant look in his eye as he spits in the face of everything that Lumon stands for in order to save a friend. And seeing Irving going from drowning Helena to holding Helly close to him in order to keep her safe was a very interesting contrast. And the sacrifice that Irving makes in this scene certainly reminded me a lot of the From Season 3 finale, when Sarah also sacrifices her soul in order to keep Boyd safe when she takes Elgin's eye out, in order to find Fatima. Two incredibly selfless acts at the end of the day done in order to save a friend. And seeing as Irving's final words were directed at Dylan was very fitting to say the least, considering how close friends the two of them were, with him telling Dylan to hang in there, a nod to the paintings according to John Turturro. One thing's for sure, going forward it certainly looks like the entire landscape of Severance has changed with this one episode, which will most likely have implications that will be felt for the rest of the season. The Severance crew, after all, lost one of their core four, but not before he tamed the temper of woe, and now I imagine the other three tempers that remain, Frolic, Dread, and Malice, are going to have to be tamed by the rest of our innie employees. And if nothing else, it should be very interesting to see how those trials manifest for each one of our severed employees going forward. But that is going to do it for our Episode 4 breakdown of Woe's Hollow, the undoubtedly most mind-bending episode of Severance to date. And definitely leave your thoughts and comments down below. What did you think of Episode 4, and how do you think the implications are going to be felt going forward? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like on your way out, and consider subscribing to stay up to date on all of our upcoming Severed content. And as always, keep those tinfoil hats on, folks, and I will see you on the next one.
Now.